Summary. After Anakin Skywalker falls to the dark side on Mortis, Obi-Wan and Ahsoka must take comfort in one another as the galaxy becomes a far more dangerous place. Spoilers for Clone Wars, selected prequel novels, and movies. This whole FIC is filled with angst and various triggers, so please go in mentally prepared. Enjoy. Obi-Wan had just enough time to raise his arms to cover his face before the sun's Sith lightning sent him to the ground, writhing in pain. It felt as though every nerve in his body had been lit on fire and melted, forcing his limbs to contort of their own accord as the electricity coursed through his muscles and blood and bone. He'd been subject to Sith lightning before, but this was far more powerful. This lightning was filled with malice and hatred of a level that made Count Dooku's powers feel like child's play. Its very touch felt like poison, sapping his strength and will to fight with every passing heartbeat. Through the agony, Obi-Wan instinctively reached out to Anakin through their bond. His heart sank as he only found darkness avoid. He frantically fought to paddle through the dark quagmire of his own mind. He bit down on his lip to stop from screaming. The bitter taste of iron entered his mouth. Nothing. There wasn't even a single hint that the bond had ever existed. For all intents and purposes, Anakin Skywalker had never been his Padawan, at least not in the Force. Sluggishly, Obi-Wan realized that he should have anticipated something like this to happen, to feel emptiness in his mind where there once had been light. If he'd learned anything in the last day, it was that anything could happen on the planet Mortis. Or was it a planet? That, too, was a question. All he knew was that he was at the mercy of the planet's inhabitants, with about as much autonomy as a hollow chess piece had over the challenger controlling it. The red lightning died away, but Obi-Wan barely could tell the difference. Breathing uneven and labored, Obi-Wan leaned his head back onto the dark stone and struggled to breathe. Blood seeped down his throat, and he coughed weakly, gasping for air. He could see Anakin clearly now. The former Padawan was standing still and watching. Even at a distance, Obi-Wan could see the dark expression that pulled at Anakin's features and his terrible, corrupted, yellow eyes. Obi-Wan struggled to roll onto all fours, clutching his midsection feebly as spasms racked his tired limbs. Through their fragile bond, he could feel Ahsoka screaming for him. Her distant waves of panic felt overwhelming compared to the awful silence from Anakin, or, rather, the void the former Padawan had once occupied. "You could have done so much, Jedi," the son whispered. The hushed syllables seemed to tear right into Obi-Wan's mind. "So much potential, but you are no comparison to the Chosen One." A shadow fell over him and glowing red eyes crinkled as a terrible sound filled the air. Laughter. The son was laughing. "Anakin," Obi-Wan choked, struggling to keep his gaze locked on his former Padawan. "Why?" A strand of hair fell into his eyes, blocking his view of the sun. He would have pushed it back, making sure that he could at least see, but right now he had barely enough energy left in him to keep breathing, let alone move. "Master!" Ahsoka called desperately to him through the Force, her voice frantic. "What's happening? Can you hear me? Please, oh Force, please respond." It seems that the apprentice still calls to you," the son mused, eyes glittering. He turned to Anakin, whose expression visibly grew more conflicted. "Now, how can we fix that?" "Carking hells, no." Obi-Wan threw all of his remaining energy into the Force. Ahsoka had to know how much danger she was in. His feeble attempt met a wall of darkness and he pressed against it, struggling to break through. He felt like a caged animal, pounding against welded iron bars. There was no way that he was getting through to her now. He had lost and she was likely in for a similar fate, unless... "Anakin, don't hurt Ahsoka. She's your apprentice, Anakin." His voice was tight and raw as he pleaded with his former Padawan. "She needs you right now. You can't leave her." "Anna," he choked on his own words, blood seeping over torn lips as he coughed roughly. His breath caught and he gagged. The son hummed softly, but whether out of pity, humor, or mirth, Obi-Wan couldn't tell. Anakin turned his head away, hiding his expression. It was something that the boy done as a Padawan, but only when he'd done something wrong. That was Anakin's guilty face. Once, that face had caused Obi-Wan to become suspicious, as it almost always meant something had gone wrong or some rule had been broken. Now, however, it confirmed his gut feeling that, dark side or not, Anakin Skywalker still had a conscience. The sun's bright red eyes were still focused on Obi-Wan's face, laser-like in appearance and intensity, glowing with savage pleasure. "Now, Jedi, we are leaving this place and there is nothing you can do to stop us. The Force wielder paused. Right now, even Father cannot stop us. The second wave of Sith lightning slammed into Obi-Wan like a freight train, sending him sprawling backward. While he'd managed to stay relatively silent earlier, a scream tore past his lips this time, quickly shredding his already worn throat. The world was a hurricane of spinning red light, a maelstrom of agony, and he could feel himself thrashing on the ground. His head cracked against stone. "We will be free," hissed the son's voice, impossibly loud in his ears. Every inch of him begged for it to end. He thrashed and struggled beneath the gaze of two pairs of Sith eyes, suffocating beneath the corrupted darkness of the Force. Finally, with agonizing slowness, he began to sink back into darkness and the mercy of its deep embrace. Ahsoka caught herself dozing off once more in the midst of repairs. From what Sky Guy and Master Kenobi had said and from what she'd put together, she had actually died and then come back to life. Dying was tiring, there were no two ways about it. A part of her was desperate to know what had happened after being bitten by that twisted creature in the cell. Or had it been a creature at all? Her gut instinct was that it had been the sun, but she'd passed out before she'd been able to see anything. It was an annoyance. Yawning, Ahsoka pulled herself up into the cockpit. Her insides still felt off in a way she couldn't describe. The closest thing she could think of was what it felt like several weeks after recovering from broken ribs, achy, but not painful, and just healed enough to move, but not quickly. She stretched, arms extended overhead, and yawned again. The Force whispered ominously and she froze in place, brow furrowing. "Huh," she mused aloud. "Weird." The Force exploded. Pain shot through her mind and Ahsoka nearly toppled out of the chair, gripping the steering controls in front of her for support. With one hand pressed to her temple, she closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath, heart hammering inside her chest. The dark side was everywhere, filling her senses and shrouding everything around her in a thick haze. Never had she felt the dark side so powerful or potent. It was like a thick goo sliding over the light side of the Force, oozing and leaving muted trails behind it. The sensation felt worse than disgusting, it was more revolting and horrific and claustrophobic. In her mind's eye, Ahsoka pictured a writhing, terrible monster rising from a pit of black tar, its dark claws reaching towards her. Terror constricted her throat until she could hardly breathe. "Anakin, where are you?" she pleaded through the Force, reaching out through their bond. Someone was in pain, imprisoned within that awful, invisible beast, tortured and ensnared past any hope of escape. Someone. Ahsoka instantly recoiled as she felt a dark void where her master once had been. "Our bond is gone." But how? Where a calming, reassuring presence had once rested in her mind was a whirlpool of nothingness. Anakin had just vanished without a trace, and no matter how hard she tried to reach him. Breathing rapidly, she felt panic fluttering in her stomach. So much pain, but if it's not Anakin? "Master Kenobi," she whispered, horrified. Carefully, she reached into the bond she shared with her Grandmaster, scared of what she'd find. What she received was a garbled response, incoherent and filled with agony. He was trying to tell her something, repeating it over and over. Eventually, she caught, "Anna, don't hurt," but nothing more. "Master, are you okay? Master, can you please tell me what's going on? Let me help you." "Oh, Force, please respond," she called in the Force. She sounded weak in the Force, even in her own mind, like a child. Frustration clawed at her chest. She pictured her Grandmaster calm and reserved, yet kind and welcoming, heroic, yet humble. Despite Anakin's initial hesitation to take her on as an apprentice, Obi-Wan had always been there, helping her from the very beginning. She'd never told him just how much she'd looked up to him as a trainee. His kindness and reputation had been legendary among the younglings. But that was in the past. Since becoming a Padawan, Obi-Wan had become something of a second master to her, a teacher and guardian who she could always talk to. And, though she would never admit it aloud, he'd become like a father to her. Lineages were never that close, not according to Jedi history, yet, against all odds, she had been accepted into a tight, warm family. A lineage that defied all expectations and norms. As if Obi-Wan's tormentor had sensed her presence, the pain doubled in intensity. Ahsoka slipped off the seat and fell to the deck plates, hands clutching her head. A ragged gasp left her lips and tears leaked from her eyes. Ghostly echoes of a scream met her ears. Obi-Wan is in so much pain, she thought, biting her lip. He's in so much pain and there's not a cripping thing I can do about it. After a few seconds, the sensation died away. Uncurling from where she had been balled up on the floor, Ahsoka wiped her eyes and sat up, looking around in confusion. Her brain was numb and slow, like in the first few seconds of waking up from a long sleep. The pain had disappeared and quickly too. It was unnerving. Right, I'm on the ship, she reminded herself. I'm on Mortis. Breathing deeply, she tentatively reached out into the Force again. This time, there was total darkness outside of her mental walls. Both of her bonds, both cherished connections to people who she cared about dearly, were as dark and empty as the planet itself. Oh, no, please no. A sob built its way up into her throat and it nearly overcame her before she managed to force it back down. Are they dead? Where is Anakin? Is Master Kenobi alive? She stood up shakily and slowly activated Anakin's comm channel. Hello. She spoke softly, her voice oddly quiet. Master. There was no reply. Hands shaking, she changed channels and tried Obi-Wan. Still nothing, but she hadn't expected a response from him, not after what she'd sensed and felt. Oh. She let out a long sigh and closed her eyes. Breathe, Ahsoka, she told herself. Breathe. The ball of stress in the pit of her stomach lessened by an infinitesimal amount. She shook out her hands and began to fiddle with her lightsaber in a very un-Jedi-like way. Something bad happened to Obi-Wan, she was sure of it. They were on Mortis, so, of course, there was always the risk of trickery, but something like that. She shuddered, shook herself, then dropped back into the crawl space beneath the cockpit to finish the last of the repairs. The hum of a land speeder didn't come for nearly 10 minutes. Hands covered in machine oil and grease, Ahsoka froze, a driver poised over the final cluster of wiring. For a while, she only listened out of the fear that she was imagining things. Her heart began to pound. Her heightened, Togruta senses were not deceiving her. There definitely was a speeder approaching. Tossing down the tool, Ahsoka practically flew down the ramp and out into the cool night air. She squinted, scouring the landscape for the source of the sound. From what she could see through the gloom, the pilot was her master. She shifted from foot to foot urgently. Where was Master Kenobi? What had happened? Why was Anakin alone? What was all the pain? The questions seemed to burst from her mind, nearly forming on her lips by the time Anakin had climbed the closest hill and come into full view. Then, it hit her. Why had their bond been broken? Her eyes followed his dark figure. Was she imagining things, or did Anakin feel dark? A thread of doubt crossed through her mind, and uneasiness washed through her. The feeling grew like a plague, increasing with every second that her master drew closer. The Force began to whisper warnings in her mind. Her master was alone, but Obi-Wan had gone to find him. Could Obi-Wan have failed? But her master lit up the Force like a beacon, even she could have found Anakin. There was no way that Obi-Wan couldn't have found him. The whispers in the Force grew stronger and stronger, and Ahsoka found herself retreating several steps back, her heel scraping against the metal ramp of the ship. She desperately wanted everything to be okay. Maybe her master had missed Obi-Wan, that they'd both been traveling and Obi-Wan was just coming back late. But this was Mortis. That would be too good to be true, wouldn't it? It's going to be fine, it'll all be fine, just fine, she thought desperately. The moment her master came into full view, she knew that things were far from okay. Despite the dark haze that filled the entire planet, she was beginning to pick up a more localized point for some of that dark power. Anakin Skywalker, her master, reeked of anger and despair, radiating it so powerfully that it almost carried her off her feet. The Force, the warnings she'd felt, they were all whispering about that dark monster she could sense in her mind's eye, that central point from which the dark side emanated in waves. Suddenly, she had suspicion of what had happened to Obi-Wan. She desperately hoped that she was wrong. Oh, no, she thought, heart sinking. Oh, Force. Ahsoka felt like she was tearing inside, the loyalty to her master pulling against everything else, against her gut feeling, against the warnings she felt in the Force. There was a logical way for her to proceed, but she despised the thought of what it meant. Setting her jaw, Ahsoka turned on her heel and raced back into the ship. She probably had a minute before he got to the ship. 1 minute, quite possibly, to save them all. With the Force, she viciously ripped the ignition switch from the board right above the pilot's seat. Catching it, she barreled back outside and launched herself off of the ramp, and turning away in the opposite direction of the incoming speeder. She ran, tired, aching limbs barely carrying her at a fraction of the pace she would have normally been able to hold under usual circumstances. If her master had seemed powerful before, it was nothing to the raw energy that he exuded now. Waves of dark energy radiated outwards from his form, almost dizzying in power, frightening, to be sure. She could sense him at the ship and distantly hear the grunt of effort as he leaped from the speeder onto the ramp. Unable to help herself, she looked back. "Ahsoka, I'm sorry, but you don't understand what I have to do," he said, voice echoing in her mind. He leaped after her, the dark side surging as he propelled himself through the air. Now there were 15 yards between them. She kept backing up, trying to keep away from him. A knot formed in her throat, and her voice hitched as she struggled to speak. What are you? Master? What? Anakin's expression hardened and his fists clenched. What does it matter? He growled venomously. I've become what I need to be to end the war, to save everyone. As I said, you wouldn't understand. And neither did Obi-Wan. It was like a rock had landed in the pit of Ahsoka's stomach. What did you do to him? She demanded. What did you do? Her toe grazed a small stone and she stumbled. Anakin threw her a half smirk. Me? I didn't do anything. Ahsoka backed up another few steps. The look in his eyes scared Ahsoka more than she could ever put to words. She didn't recognize this monster. It wasn't his appearance or mannerisms as much as it was his presence in the Force. He was cold, icy cold, but with an undercurrent of scorching fire that burned at the touch. He was savage and manic ruthless, one look from his eyes made her blood run cold. She had never felt a presence like this before. Not even in the coldness of the sun compared to Anakin's raw, animalistic fury. I have to find Obi-Wan. I have to get out of here, she thought. Ahsoka stumbled again, this time over some loose rock and accidentally thrust out her right hand out to stabilize herself. Belatedly, she realized that it was the same hand which gripped the ignition switch. Ahsoka. Anakin's voice was calm and deadly when he next spoke, his terrible, yellow eyes bored into her like lasers. What did you do? She couldn't hold down the tears, she couldn't. I am sorry, Master. With sob, she spun on her heel and took off across the rocky terrain, tapping into every reserve of the Force that she could, willing her legs to carry her as far away from the monster who Anakin Skywalker had become. How could you betray me? A string of foul Huttese curses echoed from behind her as she tore through the rocky terrain, heading straight for the distant mountains. Tears rolled down her face, blurring her vision and nearly causing her to trip. Blood roared in her ears. Anakin was like Dooku and Grievous now. Cold and dark. He felt like a dark pit of roiling emotion in the Force. It was as to no wonder why their bond had been broken, more like shattered. But why didn't I feel it? A bond breaking, she was told, usually had a sort of psychic backlash. Even with death, the bond would still resonate briefly before it was severed. It was said to pass on hints of the other's emotional state prior to closure. But that was what made things so much stranger for Ahsoka. If she guessed correctly, she had been asleep while her master had turned a state where the mind was at its most vulnerable and not felt a single crippling thing. To her, everything had felt normal up until her Grand Master had lit up the Force with pain, a fact which was somewhat of a mystery of itself. Her bonds with her masters had only increased in strength from the moment that they'd stepped on the planet. By all means, she should have felt at least something. Then a thought occurred to her. Had Anakin felt her turn? He hadn't mentioned it at all. The sun had done it with some sort of poison, according to Obi-Wan, and it made sense when she thought of it. She wouldn't have willingly turned to the dark side, neither would Anakin. The sun. It has to be the sun. Ahsoka set her jaw and narrowed her eyes, determination rising within her. They would have to get the ignition switch from her dead body, there was no way in heck she was giving it up without a fight. She couldn't let the sun leave this place. He would bring death and destruction with him to the galaxy, that was for sure. And Anakin? The determination shattered as an icy dagger worked its way into her heart. It felt like she was being torn in half. Ahsoka, wait. Anakin's voice broke through the air, sounding just as desperate as she was. Wait. She threw a look over her shoulder and saw him, sprinting to her right, paralleling her with apparent ease. A mudded brown mess seemed to revolve around him in the Force, recognizable even without her having to look. This made it even crazier, the fact that he sounded so normal. But then he'd look at her with those yellow Sith eyes, and Ahsoka knew that she was no longer looking at the face of a Jedi. In all her years as a Padawan, she'd only been in the presence of Count Dooku once, and he hadn't even given her the chills that her master did now. And Dooku was a Sith, a known killer. Wait. His voice was raw, as though he had been screaming his lungs out not long ago. "What did he do to you?" she cried out between breaths. Anakin's voice was level when he replied. "He showed me the truth and what I will have to do to save everyone." Ahsoka was quickly running out of energy. It was as though the very air sapped her strength, depleting the already shrinking store of energy left over from her resurrection. Every bone ached, and a part of her feared that the next step would be her last. But through that fatigue, she continued to sprint on, clinging to the light inside of her with a vice and refusing to let go. The longer she ran, however, the dimmer that light became. During a particularly difficult and dangerous mission, her master had taught her to never let that light go out and that she could get lost without it. Well, now she was on a very dangerous mission of a different sort, and that light was rapidly going out. Just a matter of hours ago, she had awoken from what had felt like a deep trance, swimming back into consciousness only to find herself in the arms of her master. He had embraced her, wrapping his arms around her as friends do after a long time apart, well, most non-Jedi friends at any rate. Love and a desperate relief had resounded from him, a feeling surprisingly reflected from Obi-Wan, mixed with a sense of awe. Only later did she realize that she had returned from the dead and that many things had changed in the brief hours of darkness. Fresh tears welled into her eyes, despite all efforts to clamp down on the emotions. A tendril of thought brushed against her. "Ahsoka. Why are you running from me?" She shivered. It was Anakin's voice in her head, there was no doubting that, but the presence was just as she had expected it to be, a sly shadow that had been camouflaged in the background, hiding away in the Force, like a hunter stalking its prey. Her mental shield slammed down and she withdrew into the Force even further. As though burned, Anakin snapped back. Ahsoka didn't need to have a bond to feel the hurt and frustration her master was feeling. He projected it like a beacon. "Danjit, Ahsoka." Growling, he leaped forward, using a nearby rock pile as a springboard and flinging himself right into her path. Skidding to a halt, Ahsoka watched him move towards her, his yellow eyes looking at her with the same wary expression he usually reserved for some cornered animal, his hands stretched forwards in a soothing gesture. "Snips, you have to listen to me. The Jedi are not the guardians of peace that they say they are. They stand in the way to peace and must be destroyed. My master will make sure of it. Obi-Wan isn't." Anakin snarled at her Grand Master's name, his mechanical hand clenching into a fist. "Obi-Wan has nothing to do with this. I will attend to him later. He cannot see it and he will try to stand in my way." The Force writhed and boiled, reflecting his words. "He's still alive. Oh, thank cripping hells, I thought he was dead." Her next thought was a silent plea that he was alright, but he couldn't be alright, not after all that pain. Ahsoka searched Anakin's face, her brows furrowing. "Master, you've been teaching me to be a Jedi for almost 2 years now, why are you saying these things? I saw the future, the war snips, I saw terrible things, the sun and I, we have to leave this planet." "Ahsoka, we can save the galaxy," Anakin said, gesturing wildly with his hands, "we could end the clone war." She watched him silently. A part of her wanted to go with him, to take his hand and leave the planet. Her heart yearned to see peace and tranquility in the galaxy. Images of the destroyed cities of Relith and the battle-scarred Christophsis ran through her mind. Was there really a way to end it all? Was there a possible solution to this entire conflict? Oh, how she wanted to see it. Reality then hit her like a brick wall. She knew the answer. Of course, there wasn't. While one man could bring an end to it, it would be incredibly difficult, and the dark side wasn't the right way. She swallowed thickly at the thought of the ramifications of a galaxy under Sith rule. Jedi slaughtered, millions dead, living in the oppression of a cruel leader, that's what it would be. That's not peace, that's not solving the war. He's using you. She looked at the ground, noting how Anakin had frozen in place. He's using you. She repeated it louder the second time, raising her eyes back to her master. No, Anakin's voice was still cold in his reply, but Ahsoka thought she could catch a hint of hesitation in his reply. He wants to bring peace to the galaxy. He showed me the future. Ahsoka, shocking herself with her own nerve, stepped forwards and balled her hands into fists. "You said he showed you the future. How do you know that it's real?" He brought a hand to his forehead. "Master, I know you're in there." She was shouting now. "Please. The sun is lying, Master Obi-Wan isn't ever." It was like someone had flipped a switch inside Anakin. "Obi-Wan Kenobi," he snarled, "left me for dead, he is responsible." Ahsoka was surprised that she couldn't see the physical power of the dark side that swirled about his body. His anger was blinding in the Force, and it drove her backwards as though she had been buffeted by a strong wind. Eyes wide, Ahsoka backed up, clutching the switch tightly in her left hand while her right inched towards her lightsaber. Anakin jabbed a finger in her direction. "I will give you one more chance to join me, Ahsoka. Give me the switch, now." "Master," she retreated another step, an action which proved to be a huge mistake. In one swift motion, Anakin was off the ground and flying at her, lightsaber raised. She let loose a cry and barely managed to ignite her own blade in time to catch the blow. The sheer power of the swing sent shocks up and down her arm, knocking the lightsaber downwards with the recoil. As his saber came down again, she leaped backward, propelling herself with the force and landing in a crouch several yards away. With only a split second's worth of rest, she clipped the switch to her belt and drew her Shoto blade. Anakin was on her in seconds and it was all she could do to keep him from cutting her in half. For Ahsoka, she knew that she'd lost the moment that the fight had started. She was the student and he was the master, and that was just the beginning of her problems. Not only had he taught her many of the more advanced elements of her fighting form, but he had also practiced countless hours against her and she had never managed to beat him. Not even once. Sure, she'd come the closest after training with Obi-Wan and Master Plo for a week, surprising Anakin with a new fusion of Jarkai, but knocking him down in that fight had been like finding the needle in the haystack and then dropping it again. She had been proud of that fight, despite the fact that she'd still lost. But fighting Anakin now was like fighting of the force of nature. Even as she leaped and gave ground, dodging and fighting for her life, it did absolutely nothing. Tired and weakened as she was, she still had speed and agility that he did not possess. It was something she used to her advantage. Plus, he wasn't exactly aiming to kill yet. She fought for time and those precious few moments of freedom. Her master was going to win, it was only a matter of when. Anakin let out a growl and set his mouth curled up into a feral sneer. "I trusted you, Ahsoka. All those years, I trained you to be the perfect apprentice. Come with me and we can reshape the galaxy together." "I can't, Master, With a vicious strike, he drove his saber down over her left shoulder. She raised her blade, barely managing to hold the block as their lightsabers sputtered against one another, sending flashes of white light off to the side from where the two sabers met one another. Twisting, she spun out from under her master, leaping to the side before landing in a defensive stance several yards later. "Then you are no longer my apprentice," he said coldly. "I see Obi-Wan has left a mark on you after all. Face it, Ahsoka, you were expecting this. You knew this was coming." Coming from Anakin in the state, the comment shouldn't have hurt as much as it did. All the same, Ahsoka felt as though the air had been sucked out of her. "I learned to resist the dark side from my master," she replied, breathing hard. "And from Obi-Wan, who he suddenly hates all of a sudden." With a savage cry, Anakin raised his lightsaber and laid down strike after strike, throwing out all sense of form or technique in favor of a series of brutal physical assaults. Whether they were considered improper form or not, defending against them was dang near impossible. Each blow collided with her blade and shook her down to her toes. It was all she could do to keep her lightsabers in her hands and deflect. He was aiming for a saber lock, that much was obvious by now. Her master kept leaving open windows in his defense which, should Ahsoka take one and go on the offensive, would mean playing right into his trap. It would be over once he did because that was his style. She'd seen him fight enough times to know that he always tried to get into a position to use the force, and this was no exception. The saber lock came several moments later, and Ahsoka was reminded of how utterly screwed she was. Even as she watched, her Shoto blade slipped sideways under the intense pressure and clattered to the ground. Suddenly holding all of the weight, her right arm dipped inwards and she clasped the remaining saber with both hands in order to prevent the green blade from burying itself in her skull. They stood there frozen for nearly a minute, as though time itself had stopped. Then Anakin had her locked in the force, faster than her tired eyes could process. Ahsoka had only seen two of his fingers clench inwards before as an invisible noose wrapped itself about her neck. Taken by surprise, her hands immediately jumped to her throat, her blade deactivated as she attempted to remove the invisible fingers. Her breaths came in quick gasps, shallow, and far too light for the kind of physical exertion which she had been through. A dark haze appeared around the edges of her vision and it soon looked as though she were viewing the world through an old keyhole. This is the end, she thought miserably. A soft tug at her belt told her that he had taken the switch. The disappointment and frustration of failure boiled in her stomach as she hung there, choking. Distantly, she heard a soft exclamation of relief from her master as he obtained the equipment before she blacked out. Ahsoka awoke to the sound of screaming in the back of her mind. Someone, no, many someones were in intense pain. Her voice didn't work, and she couldn't move. Horror and unbridled panic threw her mind into a manic frenzy. As her eyes flew open, she was greeted by the dark stone of the planet, moving along slowly below her. 1, maybe 2, paces in front of her, Anakin's silhouette marched forwards, one hand extended back. The dark side had its talons wrapped about her body, freezing her in place as she floated along behind her master. Oh, right. I'm here and he's floating me behind him. I'm upside down and frozen in the Force. Don't worry, Ahsoka, don't worry. Closing her eyes and breathing as deeply as she could, Ahsoka fought to calm herself down. It took a minute, but eventually, her heart rate went down to something manageable. Without full-on meditation, there was only so much a person could do. So, instead of herself, she focused on her surroundings. Listening to the screaming, she could hear men, women, and children alike, all crying out in pain and fear. Withdrawing within her battered mental shields was all she could do not to join the mournful choir. Holding her breath, Ahsoka scanned the area as best as she could in the Force. There were only two of them, Anakin and herself. But that made no sense. The screams were loud enough to be right next to her. A groan shattered her concentration and her eyes flew open. Everything had been quiet save for the rhythmic thudding of his boots on the hard ground. Was his hand shaking? Sure enough, Anakin's free hand which was pressed to his face was trembling. From what she could see, his teeth were bared and his eyes wide, as though he was seeing something horrible. The screaming continued, relentless. Stop it, he muttered, Master Qui-Gon, stop this please, I can't see them die again. A low, disembodied voice responded. No, Anakin, if you choose this path, then there will be no turning back. This is by your doing, these are your memories. I am doing nothing. The screaming intensified. Think of what the dark side will make you do. You took your first steps when you took those lives, but you still have a chance. Do not do this, Anakin. Do not let yourself be haunted by the past. Ahsoka listened with bated breath. Qui-Gon Jinn, now that was not a name she'd ever forget. He was Obi-Wan's master. Anakin had told her that Obi-Wan hardly ever spoke of him, especially these days. It had been Master Jinn who had found Anakin on Tatooine all those years ago and fought for him with the Council, and whose dying breath had been an instruction to Obi-Wan to train the still young Anakin Skywalker. Master, why did you have to die? Why couldn't you have trained me? His voice was bitter, and Ahsoka's eyes widened. She longed to ask him why he suddenly hated Obi-Wan so much, but she stayed quiet out of fear of making them stop. Plus, she didn't even know if she could speak. I was not aware that you disliked my Padawan so much, Master Qui-Gon replied. His voice had a scathing hint to it as he replied. The dark side flared and the screaming faded. Anakin's new Force signature blanketed the area and it was oddly calm, as if he was focused on silencing the desperate cries of the lost. Despite the chills it gave her, Ahsoka found that it was much easier to hear their conversation without all the extra noise. Anakin took a deep breath. You know that I end up killing him in the future? I kill him, Ahsoka, Padme, his voice choked on the last name. Cripping hells, that was what he saw. And you hate Obi-Wan for it? What? Master Qui-Gon asked gently. He made me lose control. I become a monster. Master. He is the one who lets me do all of this. He tries to, he almost kills me, but then he lets me live and keep on. Anakin let out a garbled sound of frustration. I can't live with myself. You mean he lets you get away with all of it? We're talking about the future, Anakin, but Obi-Wan will always be Obi-Wan. He cares about you. I hope you know that he could never kill you. Anakin let out a long sigh, bowing his head slightly. He didn't finish the job. Could you do that to him? The question seemed to take him aback, shock rippling through the force. Why are we doing this? Anakin's silhouette jerked to the left as though he had been stung, and Ahsoka visualized a tall Jedi Master facing him from the right. Suppressed anger roiled beneath the surface, leaking through Anakin's shields to the point where Ahsoka felt like she was drowning in the fury. The calm blanket of darkness no longer sat idly. I'm doing this because this is wrong, Anakin, was the reply. When you were sent to the well of the dark side, this was not supposed to happen. Think of what you saw. Think of Padme. Don't even say her name, Anakin hissed. His grief was overpowering, and his voice came at a whisper. I don't It was like the voice of Master Jin was distorting, coming from a distance as Anakin's emotions flooded the Force. Your actions right now will not save her, think of the future you are creating. I don't have to listen to you. He hissed to the air, eyes bright with fury. A nearby rock pile exploded, and Ahsoka was suddenly aware of the invisible chains tightening around her. She let out a muffled cry, attempting to free herself, but to no avail. In front of her, Anakin stood still, his fists balled up at his sides and his head bowed. It didn't matter that she couldn't see his expression. Ahsoka didn't think she would have recognized him anyway. Obi-Wan was floating. Or rather, he was weightless with nothing touching him at all, and it really felt like he was floating. He became aware of an intense tingling in the back of his skull, pulsing there as if it had its own heartbeat. It was an odd sensation, and it had nabbed at his curiosity until he finally decided to open his eyes. Well, this is certainly a new one, Kenobi. Everything was dark, save for a spider-like expanse of white lines around him. Maybe they were bridges? He couldn't tell. All he knew was that everything seemed to be far away, and that he was drifting in darkness. Whispers surrounded him, voices that he thought he could recognize, but they were not coherent enough for him to place. Something tickled his chest, a sharp piercing pain right above his heart, making him cough in response. His left hand automatically shot towards the burning sensation, but he was stopped short mid-reach. Something invisible seemed to be holding him back. He looked down, breaths quickening at the sight of the blood-red, smoky hand that tightly gripped his arm. Where had that come from? Another sharp pain hit him in the chest and he curled inwards with a quiet gasp. He struggled to move but found that more red hands had come up to pull at him. Straining, he fought to break free, finding much to his dismay that he was too weak to remove himself. Kenobi. The coarse whisper came to his ears even as he struggled. Distantly, he heard a scream. Despair and pain made the sound raw. It was his own echoing cry from the heartbreaking moment all those years ago on Naboo. Memories of the Horn Zabrak flashed into his mind, sending waves of regret crashing through his mind. If only he hadn't fallen to the lower levels, he would have been there with his master inside the ray-shielded reactor core instead of standing outside, unable to do anything but watch him fall. If only he was faster, a better apprentice. Obi-Wan felt as though he was pulled underwater, drowning, as the hands continued to pull him down and down. There was no water, but the light seemed to dim, the distant bridges winking out one by one into non-existence. He let out a sigh, letting his eyes close briefly. Of all things, he wished that he could see Anakin, not the corrupted Jedi who had turned his back on him, but the rash, brilliant, impatient for the one who he'd trained for all those years. Whispers of betrayal and hate emanated from somewhere below Obi-Wan, as though a hidden ventriloquist was quietly reciting a poem in the darkness. Closing his eyes, he struggled to find peace. The dark side was all around him now, more powerful than even the depths of Mortis's hellish pit of fire. And he was tired, oh so tired. Another spike of pain radiated from his heart, and his breath hitched. There was no energy left in his body to react. Instead, he lay there and let himself be dragged further down, the previously harsh whispers quickly becoming a soothing hum in the back of his mind. The darkness was singing to him a deadly song of quiet and calm. I need to rest, I need. Obi-Wan, Qui-Gon's soft undertone was a whisper to his ears, somehow sharper than all the voices and the music calling him to sleep. Obi-Wan's mind felt lethargic even as he tried to respond. Force, he was so tired. His limbs were made of lead, his blood felt so slow and sluggish. Master, he whispered, struggling to open his eyes again. Stay with me, Obi-Wan. The low voice was soothing, but then so was the music. He just wanted to sleep, at least for a little while. Was it too much to ask? A bright light quickly filled his gaze, making him squint. He groaned as his head pounded from the sudden shock of light. A luminescent ghostly form reached out its arms, just as hundreds of dark hands tugged and grasped at his body on all sides. Renewed pain ran through his chest, sharp and throbbing this time. It was like his heart was beating too fast, pounding an irregular tempo into his collarbone. Strands of light reached down through what looked like a tear in the sky and lashed themselves to his limbs. Its touch was cool at first, but warmth began to spread through his body. It felt wondrous and oddly refreshing. But then the light began to pull him in hard. That would have been all well and good if the darkness hadn't pulled back with equal vigor. It felt as though he was being ripped apart. His heart was now beating so fast that Obi-Wan was struggling to stay conscious, crying out as he felt his blood burn from the heat of the light. Instinctively, he tried to rip his hands from the light, longing for the comforts of the dark behind him. His chest rose and fell quickly as he became lightheaded from the hyperventilation. "Life isn't done with you yet, apprentice." Qui-Gon's low voice was changing, becoming a harmony of many different, almost unfamiliar, tones. Obi-Wan just had enough time to feel the horrible sensation of his body being ripped in half before the light surrounded him with its great arms. "You will live." If the darkness had been a beautiful, fake dream, then the light was a terrible, real heck. That was at least how Obi-Wan felt when he awakened on the dark stone of Mortis. Instantly, the pain crashed over him so terribly that he had to sink his teeth into his lip to stop from screaming out loud. "Lie still," came the deep, multilayered voice of the father. "I had quite the time bringing you back. You were nearly gone by the time I arrived. My apologies." A part of Obi-Wan wished that the father had just let him rest. He was just so tired. Wait, was I just dead? Mother of Gundarks, is that what Ahsoka had to go through when she came back? No wonder she was so tired all the time. You're wondering if your companion suffered as much, the father mused. His eyes seemed to twinkle in understanding. You would be relieved to hear that I do not believe so. Do I really seem that much like a grumpy old man? The pain had mostly subsided by now and Obi-Wan analyzed his surroundings. First of all, he was no longer in the well of the dark side. Secondly, he was in the monolith's courtyard. Somehow, he reasoned that it was the father's doing. His eyes widened as he was struck by another realization, significantly more pressing and vital than the previous two. I have to warn Ahsoka. Stupid, Kenobi, that should have been the first thing you did. He struggled to sit up but immediately pulled back when the world began to spin uncontrollably. Letting out a stream of air through his teeth, he lowered himself back to the ground, shaking. I have not finished healing you, the father said sternly. You must wait. Need to warn Ahsoka, Obi-Wan breathed, sluggishly pulling his right hand to his chest. He saw with relief that his wrist comm link was still intact. There had been no other reason that it would be gone other than the sun taking it, but it was worth something all the same. Reaching up with his left hand, Obi-Wan practically smashed the button to open the frequency. Saw-Ka, come in. Dang this weakness. Dang it all. With a deep breath, he grappled with his frustration until he managed to purge it from his system. As he did so, he noted that his mental shields were in shambles. That was not good at all. Come in, Ahsoka, he repeated, voice shaking just slightly from the exertion. Nothing. It took all of his self-discipline to not try Anakin's channel. The father clearly noticed his hesitation, his eyes filling with what could be considered sympathy. My son has broken the laws of time and shown him the future. I fear that by bringing you here, I have doomed the galaxy to darkness. The father's voice was sorrowful, echoing completely through the courtyard. We can still turn this around, Obi-Wan replied, lying back as the world around him seemed to tilt again. The father interrupted him, moving closer so he could send his piercing turquoise-eyed gaze right into Obi-Wan's. In the near future, you will have an opportunity to end this. In the case that I cannot bring the Chosen One back, you are the one who must strike down my son. At the father's proclamation, dread shot through Obi-Wan's veins, and he barely could conceal the shudder that ran down his body. He hated killing, it was something that he'd tried to refrain from since his run-in with the Sith on Naboo all those years ago. Regardless of rank or any misdeeds, what gave him the right to be judge, jury, and executioner of another life? He tried to sit up once again but felt a hand gently push him back down. I will put you into a healing trance. Know that when you awaken, it will be time. You will know what to do. He would have commented on what the father had just asked him to do, protesting the whole idea and saying that he was the wrong person to do it. He also would have asked for some sort of clarification on the part about "you will know when it's time," but he found that every muscle in his body was becoming heavy and sluggish. Despite all his questions and doubts, he instinctively let the feeling wash over him. In his mind's eye, Obi-Wan saw Anakin and his yellow eyes, glaring down at him behind the red flashes of the Sith lightning. Dull grief settled in his chest, numbed by the heaviness of the oncoming healing trance. "Come back to the light, Anakin. Come back to me." Ahsoka watched as Anakin's face broke into a smile, his blue eyes twinkling as she exited the Sleep Naboo space liner. His pride resonated through the Force, mixed with a strong sense of relief which was unsurprisingly directed at Padme. Ahsoka returned the smile and let loose a long sigh as her feet finally touched solid ground. It had been a long couple days filled with action, restless sleep, and non-stop worry. She could use a break, even if it was a short one. Her mind fixated on the idea of a stroll through the gardens. Yes, that sounded very good. Behind her, Aurra Singh appeared, escorted by 6 or 7 guards, hissing as they forcibly dragged her along. Turning, Ahsoka gazed into the angry woman's darkened eyes. Aurra's face paint was rubbing off, smearing into a gothic array of bruise-like patches above and below her eyes. The contrast between the paint and her ivory skin did no favors in making her seem less zombie-like. Ahsoka suppressed a shudder. Anakin came to stand with her, his shoes softly thudding on the metal floor of the docking bay. He patted her on the shoulder, offering a wide smile down at her before turning to Padme and executing a bow. Ahsoka had caught herself rolling her eyes. He was about one of the least subtle people on the face of the planet. It was a wonder how Obi-Wan could even function on missions with him, what with the whole negotiator title and all. Clearly, she hadn't been able to hide away all of her sarcastic thoughts, for the next thing she knew, Anakin's blue eyes were boring holes in her skull. The three of them watched Aurra Singh depart for the Republic Detention Center, before splitting up. Ahsoka was let loose much to her joy and immediately headed for the gardens. In typical Anakin fashion, he made Ahsoka some transparent excuse for leaving before running off with the senator. That time, Ahsoka really did roll her eyes. Good times, good times. Ahsoka withdrew from the memory and made an attempt to look around. She was still floating and surrounded by rocks, that was for sure. Staring up at the darkened sky, she groaned aloud. It was so incredibly irritating that she could do nothing. The longer she stayed in her master's new, dark presence, the more she had become convinced that he was stronger than before. What earlier had been a muddy mess had evened out like a turbulent pool of water gone still. It seemed that his inner conflict, his constant mental battle against the darkness, had vanished without a trace. It was like a curtain being lifted, leaving only a cold resolve in the Force. Of course, it wasn't a perfect resolve, more like an enhanced chill in the Force that was positively tame in comparison to its former self. But Ahsoka knew that the cold was temporary. Should she poke and prod at that mask or list a chosen few trigger words, the resulting explosion of rage would be pure and unchained. The terrible thing was that it made perfect sense as to why he was so much more powerful now. A part of her couldn't believe that she was even thinking of him in such a way. Every bone in her body was screaming that her master hadn't fallen and that she was deluding herself, but her brain was reminding her of the Jedi and their borderline unrealistic standards which he had fought against for years. No attachments, no emotion, no love, no hate, and so on. He had fought against those same rules every single day, and that internal war had bogged him down, slowing his decisions. Now, it seemed all that hesitation was gone, right along with his doubt, morality, and everything else that had made Anakin Skywalker her master. Obi-Wan had known about Anakin's struggle. Ahsoka, who had been taken aback at first by how quickly her new master reached his boiling point, had broached the subject of his internal maelstrom early on in her apprenticeship to her Grand Master in private, of course. Obi-Wan had only shaken his head, telling her that it was a part of Anakin which he had tried to reach and failed. Ahsoka had looked into his eyes and seen sadness mixed with a strange melancholy which she later identified as a form of self-incrimination. After that, it only took her several seconds to realize that Obi-Wan blamed himself for Anakin's shortcomings, and that Anakin, despite thinking that he knew everything, did not realize how much his former master still cared. Seeing Anakin now, what with his yellow eyes and dark presence, the entire situation seemed downright tragic. Just thinking of Obi-Wan and what he would say nearly brought Ahsoka to tears once more. Think here and now, Ahsoka. Think here and now. Anakin still held her in place, plodding slowly back to the ship without even a hint of fatigue, a fact that intrigued Ahsoka more than anything else. Above them, the sky was dark and gloomy, blending in with the darkened stone and mist. Nothing had changed. She let out a long breath of air and let her eyelids slide closed, giving into another attempt at meditation. The calm did not come easy. In the depths of what little light in the force she had, it took Ahsoka a moment to realize that the voices she could hear were real. Her eyes snapping open, she struggled once more within her force-constructed restraints. The distant silhouette of their crashed ship stood out against the rocky planet nearby. 3 figures moved about next to it, 2 of them dressed in light clothes while the third seemed to soak up the dim light around it, the sun. Ahsoka's heart leaped as she thought she spied Obi-Wan's cream-colored robes. That had to have been the father there too, she thought wildly. I don't know anyone else wearing teal. Anakin had halted his approach and stood there, silently watching. Much to Ahsoka's dismay, her master had planted himself right in her line of sight, blocking her line of sight to all but the sun. Ugh. She grappled her frustration back into the Force, surprising herself with how easily it left her. A part of her hoped that Anakin could feel how well she had let go of her emotions and offer some sort of comment, proud or not. It was a hopeless wish and Ahsoka knew it, but the old Anakin would have been proud of her emotional control. There was a strangled cry and suddenly she was falling. It was only through repeated practice that she managed to roll, absorbing the impact of the fall and coming up on one knee. Out of habit, her hands shot to her belt. With a jolt, she was reminded of the pair of lightsabers which Anakin had taken earlier. Whipping about, she watched her master's form flying toward the ship at breakneck speed, his deactivated lightsaber clutched in his right hand. Above him, just past the crest of the hill, the teal figure was on the ground, the sun leaned over him. Ahsoka's stomach plummeted. Obi-Wan was nowhere to be seen, but that wasn't what was bothering her. Was that a sword in the father's chest? She took off after Anakin, blood pounding in her ears. Every step hurt, sending shooting spasms up her legs and into her chest, which was oddly tight. Her shoulders were stiff from being trapped for so long in bad posture, aching terribly as she sprinted up the hill toward the ship. More than ever, she could feel the strain of fighting Anakin earlier, not to mention the preceding trip to the afterlife and back which had drained her of so much strength. The father and son were growing closer and closer in her field of vision. Ahsoka could see the son's grief-stricken face and the way he held the father, the cursed dagger lying far behind them, clearly thrown backward out of grief. A great tear in the middle of the father's chest was the only sign that something had gone wrong. Though she hadn't seen the act, Ahsoka could guess what had happened. The father stabbed himself, she thought in horror. What? In front of her, Anakin slowed, before halting. Ahsoka followed suit, keeping a solid 3 or 4 meters between them. There was no way in heck she was going closer to her master than she needed to, despite her every instinct to go and stand by him. The son was sobbing pitifully and the father was comforting him in a low voice. Neither of them seemed aware of the figure slowly rising from the shadows nearby, specter-like in the thick mist behind the sun. Preoccupied with the father, the dark man was oblivious to what happened behind him. I knew there was good in you, the father pulled the son into a tight hug, raising his head a fraction of an inch to stare at the figure. Obi-Wan approached slowly and Ahsoka's eyes widened as she saw a deep conflict painted there. Brow furrowed, eyes trained downwards, her Grand Master approached slowly. In his hand, the cylindrical form of his lightsaber glittered. He was about a meter from the sun when the growing tension seemed to finally burst. Several things happened at once. Anakin, who finally seemed to catch on to what was about to happen, lurched into action, igniting his blade and letting loose a raw cry. No. At that moment, even before her master's feet had left the ground, the Force called to Ahsoka. Well, called wasn't even the proper word for it. More like screamed. Without many notions of what she was even attempting, Ahsoka leaped forwards, diving for Anakin's legs in earnest. The force of her jump carried him off of his feet and he came crashing down on top of her. But that was only half of the picture. What Ahsoka didn't see was the terrible indecisiveness in Obi-Wan's face as he ignited his blade, the way that it shook in his grip, or how an unseen hand jerked the weapon forwards and deep into the spine of the son who found himself a prisoner of his father's embrace. The only thing she did see was her Grand Master jerking back from the 2 doomed family members, his lightsaber flying out of his hand and landing nearby with a clatter. She heard his cry and Anakin's despairing grasp, feeling a similar horror enter her mind as she watched the lifeless body of the son fall to the ground. Earlier, awakening from a healing trance wasn't exactly what Obi-Wan would describe as a pleasant experience. Since the war, his trips to the Bacta tank and healing wing had increased, as had the amount of time he'd spent sleeping under the influence of the said trance. He loathed it deeply. It was the looks of pity, the constant worries, and should it be deemed necessary the arduous recovery that only added to the increasing pile of gripes. Once, during a particularly nasty mission, he'd had a chunk of his lower back chewed up by a vengeful droid. Anakin's young Padawan brain had nearly imploded when he'd found Obi-Wan lying flat on his back, pinned to the ground by the bolt through his ankle, barely holding back a robotic arm from ripping apart his throat. Nasty business. Of course, he'd survived, but by a much closer margin than he'd ever care to remember. In fact, the only thing he remembered of the return trip was Anakin's fear breaking apart every fragile object within a 10-meter radius. He'd awoken in the Jedi Temple's halls of healing nearly a week later, suffocating on Bacta fluid and off his face on cheap pain meds. Well, he knew he'd been off his face because he doubted that Master Yoda walked on the ceiling in his spare time. That and the fact that he didn't think that Mace had ever donned a stripper costume or a yellow sun hat ever. Later, he was told the story of Anakin force-feeding him pain meds on the trip home and messing up the dosage. Back then, he could spend his times in healing with nothing but the lost days of teaching to worry about. Sure, he'd had to deal with his anxious, impatient Padawan, but there wasn't a war. Steadily, the allocated healing time had decreased as demand increased. Jedi numbers had dropped and healers suddenly became rare like small, precious gemstones. Now, he had to worry about the next battle. Not just that, but the Republic depended on his successes. A single fight in his absence could lose the war, a fact which he had soon realized after being appointed general. But right now, neither the Republic, nor the war really mattered to him. No, it was the people he was failing with every passing minute of inactivity. Ahsoka had been left alone and vulnerable in her weakened state. Heck, she was probably already facing Anakin on her own, maybe the son as well. What use are you in your current state, Kenobi? He asked himself. He remembered all those times that Qui-Gon had lectured him on patience and sank deeper into the Force in search of an answer. Master, is there a way out of this? For a moment, he felt a shadow of his master's presence brush against his mind before it danced away. Obi-Wan let his disappointment rush out of him and dissolve into the Force. The selfish part of his soul, which he had worked so hard to expel, wanted to at least hear Qui-Gon's voice again. I will trust in the Force, Master. Just as I trust you. His head hurt like the biggest hangover he'd had in decades. Obi-Wan automatically brought his hands to his face, rubbing the bridge of his nose firmly to minimal effect. Groaning, he opened his eyes and sent the Force a silent thank you for it being dark. At least he didn't have to deal with the half-blinding light of the halls of healing. He was in a large room constructed of the same dark stone as the planet, chiseled and roughly hewn. A faint light came through the open window near the foot of the bed, its simple cloth curtains waving in the soft breeze. Closing his eyes, he took in a deep breath through his nose before exhaling out his mouth. Though his body ached, he felt oddly replenished. That must have been one heck of a healing trance. Somehow, he didn't doubt it, considering the father had been the one to put him under. Obi-Wan silently rose into a sitting position and stretched before swinging his legs off of the bed. As he moved, his joints cracked and popped, making him internally wince. I guess I'm getting old, he mused. Are you ready? Came the father's deep voice. Obi-Wan had not heard him come and turned his head so quickly that the world spun. Closing one eye, he acknowledged the renewed pounding in his forehead and reached into the Force. Silently, he isolated the pain and nudged it with his mind, coaxing it away. Only when the world returned to its normal focus did he reopen the other eye slowly. Only seconds had passed, but the room already felt as silent as a graveyard. He found himself fighting to stay in a neutral mood as the piercing blue eyes of the father bored into his skull. I know what you want me to do, he said flatly, eyes trained on the father's left shoulder. You want me to kill your son, don't you? The father heaved a sigh and glided to the window without a sound. Obi-Wan watched him intently. The old man's deeply lined face was twisted with grief. Do I want you to kill my son? He turned to Obi-Wan, his hand grasping the windowsill. No, I do not. But it is necessary. Necessary. There's always an explanation behind that word. Obi-Wan stared down at his hands. You said earlier that you originally planned for Anakin to do it. Why him? He slowly lurched to his feet, a hand pressing the wall for stability. At his side, the metal of his lightsaber connected with the rough stone, clanging softly in the silent air. "He was the natural choice," came the reply. "He is both strong and driven when it comes to doing what is right. He has proven himself to be the chosen one." The frown that had begun at the very start of the father's response blossomed into a full-blown scowl. Chosen one? The prophecy again? Even before Anakin officially became his Padawan, the idea that he was the prophesized individual had latched onto him like a hungry tick. It had differentiated him from the other trainees almost instantly and created quite an amount of friction between himself and his upperclassmen. He'd excelled in combat, flying, and engineering, not to mention setting record after record on the different physical and force-related tests. Needless to say, it had fed his ego to the point where the more reckless and arrogant aspects of his personality had become irreversible. Despite this, Anakin had gone through his fair share of struggles. Emotional control and writing were two major issues, not to mention the extremely difficult meditation sessions had plagued him since his early Padawan days. The Chosen One. The title alone had given Obi-Wan enough pain for a lifetime. "Can you help, Anakin?" he asked, carefully watching the father's expression. After a few seconds, he deduced it would be easier reading a rock. "Great. Yes," came the reply, and Obi-Wan felt relief enter his mind. But it was too soon to celebrate. There was just too much at stake to be careless. So much could go wrong at any minute. Heck, the world could end for all he knew. That was Mortis. "I must come into contact with him," the father continued. "I will warn you, it is unlikely that my son will let me near your apprentice. He will know what I intend to do." "Right," Obi-Wan nodded, "and I'm guessing that's where I come in." "Yes. You must kill my son." Obi-Wan cleared his throat and fixated his eyes on the roughly hewn archway which led to the main hall. He wasn't comfortable with killing, he never had since his Padawan days. He fought for life and sought to save instead of taking. His hesitation had only grown after Maul. But there were some things he would rather not dig up. They were fragments, scar tissue left behind by the tragedy of years past. It was now that he had to decide what to do. His mind whispered doubts, and he smoothly let the practiced mask of the negotiator fall, hiding his internal dilemma from the outside world. There was a very big if about whether he could even manage to kill the son in the first place, at least in his mind, there was. Darkness and corrupt nature aside, many things differentiated Darth Maul and the son. Maul, whose name hadn't been divulged in interrogation until months after Naboo, had been upfront and violent, playing right into many of the more common Sith stereotypes. They say never to doubt your abilities on the eve of battle. Find balance. Obi-Wan, not for the first time, wished the father wasn't so dang perceptive. He cleared his throat but remained silent. For every reason he felt it was necessary to respond, 20 more popped into his head urging him not to. Instead, he focused inward. Years of practice allowed him to shed the layers of insecurity without hesitation. He was a Jedi and they could not be allowed to think such things. He had to go through with this. Their lives depended on it. Obi-Wan had been walking for only a few seconds before blinking and remerging near the ship. This had happened only once before when he'd been searching for the father. It was a strange sensation, like every cell in his body was being pulled forward by a vacuum. The father was just ahead of him, his graceful figure gliding as though he were a ghost. Above them lay the ship, perched on the distant hill like a collapsed metallic bird. Even from where he stood, Obi-Wan could see the large, dark gashes in the hull, traces of Anakin's less than pleasant landing. Who could blame him? Obi-Wan would certainly have had a similar reaction if Padawan Anakin Skywalker had suddenly been abducted by what some would call a god of darkness. Speaking of darkness, framed by the faint light of the cabin, the shape of a towering man could be seen standing by the ramp of the ship. Even as Obi-Wan watched, the man shifted his weight and a flash of red eyes lit the night. "He knows we're here," he said evenly. The father bowed his head. There was no way of getting here without his knowledge. Obi-Wan hummed softly in agreement. He didn't doubt it. They made their way up the hill slowly. With every passing step, the air seemed to grow heavier. Obi-Wan began to feel the pull of memories which he'd worked so hard to bury as they worked to consume his thoughts and plunge him deep into despair. In his mind's eye, he saw the young woman on Relith who had been shot right in front of him, the farmer on Felucia who hadn't escaped the pirate's viperblade, and the many families he'd seen suffer at the hands of General Grievous. One by one, he squashed the memories back. They were the past. I learned from each one of those memories and I will not make the same mistakes again. Without realizing it, his hand crept up to his belt. The cold touch of his lightsaber was surprisingly welcome. Hand still at his hip, Obi-Wan threw a glance upward at the top of the hill. He frowned. The hill was not that tall, but for some unforeseen reason, both it and the sun seemed to keep getting farther and farther away. Heck, they were walking in circles. Confusion entered his mind and he grappled with the idea of what was happening, but his mind seemed to slow down even further. He stopped. Something was wrong. Even his foggy brain could tell that much for sure. He clapped a hand to his forehead, pinching the bridge of his nose. He could feel the father's eyes on him, raking over his face. "Why do you do this, my son?" he heard the father ask. Suddenly, his mind was clear. Obi-Wan spun around, keenly aware that there was an immensely dark presence behind him. His lightsaber flew into the palm of his right hand and he was sorely tempted to ignite it, restraining only under the terrible realization that it would do absolutely no good in this situation. Somehow, the sun had managed to influence him, bending his perception and dulling his thoughts. He didn't even dare guess on how much power and skill it took just to get a fraction of the potency without some rare Sith artifact. Now his mind really did flash back to a terrible place, one which could be described with a single trigger word: Zigala. If he never had to think about that planet again, it would still be too soon. Deep in wild space and surrounded by a whole host of terrible rumors, the Sith-controlled planet had been the home to a Sith temple filled with deadly artifacts. He, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Bail Organa had been tasked with destroying the Sith roots there, something which had proved far more deadly than either of them could have possibly imagined. Needless to say, Obi-Wan had barely made it out alive. Heck, Bail Organa had barely made it either. Obi-Wan had almost killed the man himself once the Sith hallucinations had kicked in. Mortis was almost as bad in atmosphere, but the dark side felt so much more potent. Zigala had been made terrible through engineering, but Mortis was an entirely different beast. It lived the dark side. The sun glanced down at him before brushing past and facing the father, his arrogance filling the air. "Father, you know that I have a destiny elsewhere. You know that I don't belong here." The man's voice was filled with desperation. Obi-Wan recalled the way that Anakin, back in his earliest days, had developed a similar tone of voice. "Yes," the father replied, still stone-faced, "I do. But you must understand why I cannot allow you to leave." Rage began to seep into the Force, projected by the sun, much like a cracked pane of glass holding back a powerful flow of water. "How can you do this?" The sun protested. "We have been kept here like animals. Is this what you wanted, Father? The life of a caged beast?" The man was positively spitting. What Obi-Wan could see of his face was contorted into a snarl. Obi-Wan edged around the fight, moving behind the son's back. Was this what the father had meant by giving him a window of opportunity? He froze in place, waiting. It was possible that the father could give him a sign. "Son, I never wanted you to have a life like this," the father was saying, his head bowed. "I wanted you to be free. You've kept me on this planet my entire life." The son yelled, his voice raw. The man strode forward until he was nose to nose with the father, who backed up almost immediately. A pale fist rose, preparing to strike, a silvery dagger materializing in its clutches. Obi-Wan acted. There wasn't much he could do. He thought of Anakin and Ahsoka and his lightsaber blazed to life. He pulled the Force in around him and shot off of the ground, shooting forwards with as much speed as he could muster. 3 meters. 2. 1. The son's laugh filled the air as he lowered the dagger. "I should have known that you would bring someone. Too weak to take me alone, Father. But let's face it, that isn't exactly a surprise, is it?" Obi-Wan was floating, suspended in limbo above the ground, his lightsaber still raised. His eyes widened as a red tendril of light extended from the sun's fingertips and snaked its way towards him. The father lunged forwards. "No. Shut up, old man." The son shoved the man away and turned his focus onto Obi-Wan, a sneer twisting his expression. "You," he drawled, "the master without an apprentice, how touching that you should come to my father's defense. He's useless, anyone can tell that. Let him die. I never would have thought myself as useless." The father raised his hands and the son was thrown to the side and into the nearest rock face, cracking the stone, crying out as his hand hit a sharp corner. No blood spilled from what should have been a sizable wound. As the son's influence broke off, Obi-Wan fell to the ground, but not before a touch of the red light had curled into his chest. He met the stone with his hands, preventing himself from landing on his face. His knees bashed into the ground rather painfully, but it was nothing he couldn't tolerate. Shaking his head, he just barely had a chance to look up before the father sent him flying backward as the sun's red lightning connected with the spot where he'd just been crouched only seconds before. The force shove hadn't been that strong and he easily was able to pull himself back up. The problem, the fogginess around his head had returned rather badly. Flashes of white ghostly forms flickered in and out of his vision. "Blast," he muttered. It was the sun again, he knew it. For a moment, he tottered around in place, staring around with wide eyes at his surroundings. It was incredible and horrifying at the same time. Bits and pieces of memory floated in and out of view, surrounded in the same milky white fog. He saw himself, 10 to 12 years younger, grappling a Trandos hand bounty hunter to the ground while a young Anakin deflected blaster bolts away. Nearby, Qui-Gon Jinn stood beside a young Obi-Wan, hooded and shaking his head in what looked like disappointment. Just over his left shoulder stood Darth Maul, his Sith mask gaze resting on a dying Jedi on the ground, a fatal lightsaber wound burned all the way through his chest. Obi-Wan's blood ran cold. He remembered that moment too well, reliving it for months afterward and waking in a cold sweat. Only over long years had the memory of his master's death begun to lessen in intensity, but it never lost its power to send Obi-Wan Kenobi years into the past and back to what he had always thought to be his greatest failure. His heart hammered within his chest and he squinted in an attempt to see where the son and father had gone. Whatever devilish trick the son had cast him under had clearly not been strong. While every single memory was a distraction, triggering emotions within him, he could still focus. He realized that, had the visions been more potent, he could have easily lost his way. "Where are you?" Finally, he saw two shapes on the edge of his vision. They were faint, but clearly not a part of his vision. A tinge of red emanated from one of the forms, lighting up the dark blotch with a lamp-like glow. The sun. It was like traveling through a small hurricane. As soon as he took his first step, the world began to spin and a wind howled in his ears. Whispers assaulted his ears, incoherent, but all clearly people whom he knew. He caught snippets of screaming, all Anakin's voice, paired with his own cry terrible and raw. Something similar came with Ahsoka's voice, almost understandably screaming his name, sounding as though she were for something he could not hear. "Ignore it, Kenobi, ignore it." But it was so hard to stay focused on the pinprick forms ahead of him. The closer he came, the farther he seemed to be the same as earlier but worse. The air itself vibrated with power as tendrils of light snaked down towards his eyes. He automatically brought a hand up to bat away the glowing fingers but found that it did nothing. A dark line was approaching like an oncoming wall, cutting off all living things beyond it. It was a black hole in comparison to the dizzying tornado he was in. He mentally counted down to the rim and when he reached it, paused. Mentally, he drew in his shields even further, bringing his energy inwards. In his hand, he clutched his lightsaber in tightly, igniting it. He closed his eyes and washed away all of his hesitations. This was for Anakin and Ahsoka's futures, heck, it was for the sake of the galaxy. If he didn't end the sun while he was on Mortis, it would be the end. This was his chance. He narrowed his eyes. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The father was on the ground and the son was leaning over him. As Obi-Wan stepped through the barrier, he was met with a wave of grief and nearly fell as it washed over him like a tidal wave. He closed his eyes and let the emotions roll off of him. It was crucial that nothing distracted him. He could not. When Obi-Wan opened his eyes, his heart skipped a beat. The two figures in front of him had changed, morphed from what they had been before. Eyes wide, he took in the body of Qui-Gon Jinn laid out over the cold stone. The dark form of Anakin Skywalker leaned over him, grieving. A deep puncture wound marred the front of his master's cream-colored robes. He faltered, his lightsaber becoming loose in his grip. It was so real, so clear and clean. Was it real? How could it be? But how could it not be? Over the years, he'd memorized all the creases and wrinkles of Qui-Gon Jinn's face. They made him different than everyone else, separating him from any wannabe imposter. No one, save for the Force ghost of his master himself, had managed such a clean image. He shook his head, remembering the body on the funeral pyre. This can't be real. It can't be. One foot moved in front of the other, moving him forwards. He had to keep going. It was fake. It was all fake. Anakin shifted his back to him, shoulders hunched as he held Qui-Gon's hand in his own. "I'm sorry," the man whispered, "I killed them all, Master." I choked up. Anakin passed a hand over his face. Struck by such a vulnerable moment from usually such a guarded person, Obi-Wan froze. "It's a lie, Obi-Wan, do not trust your eyes," came the disembodied voice of Qui-Gon Jinn. Every sense screaming for him to stop, Obi-Wan raised his lightsaber. He was within striking distance. A single sneeze and the unaware former apprentice would be dead. It would be so easy, but it felt so wrong. "It's so real." "Master." "It's not, Obi-Wan, trust me. It's an illusion." Just then, Anakin turned around, shrinking in form as he went, the same heavy mist engulfing him. It wasn't long before Obi-Wan found himself facing the same 9-year-old boy which he'd comforted after Qui-Gon's funeral pyre. Tear-stained blue eyes stared into his, wide and innocent. "Obi-Wan." Qui-Gon's desperate cry filled the air around him. But that didn't make it any easier. Sith or not, Obi-Wan felt his morality stay his hand, pulling at his mind which still howled that this was fake. His hand shook and he gritted his teeth, indecisive. It felt so wrong. Everything felt so wrong. All of a sudden, a power seized his arm and pulled him forwards. Automatically he backpedaled, his face betraying his surprise and horror as the white-blue blade of his lightsaber buried itself into Anakin's chest. The child's mouth opened and Obi-Wan heard a terrible scream in the Force. Reality crashed back as the darkness of Mortis returned. As the planet's atmosphere met his eyes, Obi-Wan stepped back, gasping for breath. His lightsaber fell from his hand and clattered to the dark stone nearby. Before him, the sun lay collapsed on the ground, now a lifeless corpse held in the arms of his father. Summary: a dying father and an upcoming drastic change of scenery. He sighed and slowly lowered the body to the ground. Beneath semi-closed lids, the dusky red of his son's lifeless gaze seemed to penetrate his soul with an icy dagger. It was as though the boy were merely asleep. The scene was such a stark contrast to the fiery volcano of uncontrollable anger that it was surreal. Despite his ways, the boy had been a free spirit, loving his family deeper either of them could possibly imagine. If not for such volatile emotions, they might have all been spared. That, however, did not make a father love his son any less. Mortis is a cage. It is a prison. Both had been the latest descriptions of life on the God-forsaken planet according to his son. "I am sorry, my children. There is no way for me to express how much I wanted for you, and how I failed." Focusing inwards, he could practically see his life leaving his body from the wound in his chest. There was a light approaching slowly, creeping closer and closer with every passing breath. It would be arriving soon, very soon. The Jedi Master was in front of him, his lightsaber fallen to the ground from where he had dropped. The bright white light, which had surrounded the man since he had arrived, flickered. He had been touched by darkness, but he would recover. Regret tasted bitter in his mouth. In his scramble for control, he had been a fool. The Chosen One and his companions had paid for his mistake dearly, but perhaps it was not too late to mend the past mistake. He turned his gaze to the two figures rapidly approaching from the base of the hill. First, came the Chosen One, the pinnacle of power and raw potential in a mortal form, followed by his apprentice whose light was rapidly flickering out. The girl had overextended herself. No child should have to face death and return so quickly. Though the Force was kind and forgiving, the body seldom could withstand such physical strain, no matter how it was brought back from the other's side. Reeling in his power, he felt the earth itself tremor slightly. Mortis was constructed in the very depths of the Force, sustaining itself in tandem with the outside world invisible to all. Where the Force was the planet's core, he was its living heartbeat, pumping his own life into every mountain and tree to maintain balance. Until recently, he had also been the guardian of his children, imprisoning them to their own doom. He might be dying, but he was not dead yet. Time seemed to slow down as he concentrated, willing the last of his energy to obey his call. It obliged as always, surging from the planet itself to aid him. With a soft mind probe, he reached out to the Chosen One's apprentice, washing the young girl's pain away with ease. Her legs buckled as she fell to the ground. "I am sorry, but I have not the strength to cushion your fall, young apprentice," he whispered to her through the Force. "Sleep now." The Jedi Master lurched forwards, his gaze fixed on the fallen girl, but was blocked by the Chosen One who advanced with narrowed eyes. Turmoil filled the young man's mind, masked by many layers of deceptive calm. The pair faced each other, their force signatures blending and weaving through one another. Their close companionship was showing. The Chosen One was looking at his master with a mixture of shame and frustration. Self-hatred swirled around him, forming a roiling, twisted creature in the Force. Flashes of raw emotion seeped through the lockdown folds of mental shielding, oozing out of the cracks like small trickles of water through a leaky dam. Images of the dead flickered in and out of his mind. First was a beautiful brunette woman, next, the Jedi Master himself, then more and more. They were the remnants of the forbidden technique used by his son. Grief. Anger. Sorrow. The Chosen One would forever carry darkness, but some of it could be removed. He sharpened his mind into a steel blade, throwing himself forwards and assaulting the Chosen One's mind with all his might. Decades of slaughter and death washed through the connection, slogging into his mind as the corrupted thoughts left the young man's body. A hysterical babble of tormented voices assaulted his conscience, piercing his ears with their terrible screams for help. They were the victims of the dark future, the lost, oppressed, and murdered. A much more human cry joined them as the young man joined their ghostly chorus. The Jedi Master was standing over him, shaking his former apprentice despite the terrible risk of physical backlash. After all the pain and misery, he was still the Master and the Chosen One, his apprentice. One could only hope that the bond would hold back the pain yet to come. The three of them would need each other to survive. Whether they knew it or not, the Chosen One was not the only one with a destiny. And the fate of the galaxy depended on their every choice. The light was coming closer, approaching with a finality. He embraced it willingly, letting it shine over Mortis for the first time since his daughter's passing. The light washed over the young apprentice first, her body dissolving into the light. His daughter's spirit would live on within the girl's soul, giving it strength even in the darkest of places. For now, however, it pulled the young one deeper into a restful slumber. Next, it engulfed the Jedi Master, who automatically opened his heart to its warm touch before disappearing as well. The man was strong, but that strength was to be put to the test. While the Chosen One was the power and the apprentice the glue, he the Master was the guiding hand born of a turbulent lineage. "May the Force be with you, Master Jedi," he whispered. Distantly, he saw the light finally envelop the Chosen One's hunched form. The young man had a life ahead of him, one which was riddled with obstacles and countless choices. It was worrying to see the darkness within the man's soul, to be sure, but many ties also bound him to the light. Not all the pieces are on the board quite yet, he mused aloud. The light surged across Mortis even stronger, tearing away at the dark exterior until nothing remained but the brightness of a newborn star. It was time. "I wish you well, Skywalker, for I now leave the galaxy in your hands. Farewell." Rex didn't know what to think. The Jedi ship had been a fast-approaching blip on their scanners, its occupants portrayed as three suspended blue-white forms on the hollow table, before disappearing into thin air. The ship had vanished without a trace, seeming to vaporize into nothingness, no hyperspace, no nothing. As for the holograms, well, the connection had cut out, cutting General Skywalker off mid-speech. That in itself had been strange. Beside him, Yularen pressed several buttons on the console, hoping to restore the link. Nothing. Cody, who had been hanging back farther in the room, turned to the nearest navigator and asked, "What's the status on their approach?" The befuddled clone shook his head, gesturing with his hands to a completely clear navigation screen. Cody's frown deepened, lines creasing in his forehead. Yularen cursed softly. They had just gotten out of a tough firefight not even 10 hours ago, and the rendezvous had been scheduled to align with a much-needed supply restock. If the Jedi were missing, it could mean serious problems with their next assignment, providing that it wasn't just a sensor malfunction. But Rex's gut was twisting, telling him that there was more to it than just a simple computer glitch. He'd seen too much weird stuff in his life. "Double-check those readings," Cody was saying to a tech. "I want those scanners checked again. Jedi don't usually just disappear into thin air." "Captain." Yularen had turned his gaze onto Rex, who immediately jumped to attention. "I want a team out there on the double. We don't have much time to just sit here and wait. We may have an hour or so before we need to make the jump to our supply station. I want eyes on the outside." "Yes, sir." Rex saluted and made his way to the exit, nodding to Cody on the way out. The clone commander's good luck followed him out the door. The truth was that there really wasn't anything to report. It was infuriating, to say the least. Rex closed his eyes, automatically shifting his helmet closer to his body from where he held it at his side. In front of him, Fives fidgeted slightly, gloved fingers softly tapping the pearly armor plating at his hip. Around him, the usual commotion of the docking bay seemed oddly muted, as though it were some silly holodrama with its volume turned all the way down. Technicians and dock workers hustled to and fro, arms laden with an array of parts, data pads, and other pieces of equipment. The sheer normality of the atmosphere should have given Rex at least some comfort, but instead he found it oddly oppressing. Something just felt so wrong about the whole thing. He tried to tell himself that he was overreacting. But that didn't change the fact that Fives stood before him, looking just as confused and worried as he felt, having just returned from the search party. And you're sure you didn't see anything out of the ordinary? Rex had to work to keep the impatience out of his voice. Fives gestured wildly, a resigned expression pulling at the growing frown lines in his face. With all due respect, sir, there was nothing out there to look at. What's going on? Rex ran a hand through his short-cut hair. Look, I don't know what the heck is happening right now. None of us do. The general was close to the Resolute when the ship disappeared, and he would have informed us if he were going into hyperspace. Other than that, we're down 2 generals and a commander, there's not much else to say. He let out a frustrated huff. Folding his arms, Fives fixed his gaze on the nearest ship, a Standard Republic LAAT/C. How are you going to explain this one? He let out a bark of fake laughter. The Jedi ship was swallowed by a giant sand CR. Rex shot the other clone a glare. He had to hand it to Fives, the man had at least tried to diffuse the tension a little bit. The smile which had somehow crept onto his face fell. Time to report. We'd better report to the Admiral. He heft his helmet and began to move towards the exit. Behind him, he heard Fives hurrying to catch up, the sound of his footsteps soon swallowed by the organized chaos around them. As they passed the stack of crates next to the doorway, several off-duty pilots stopped what they were doing in order to watch them pass by. Rex offered them a nod of greeting, but said nothing. Those men had been on the search party, so it wasn't exactly like he could give them any sort of news. Judging by their unmasked, hopeful faces, however, all of them were looking for some sign of good news. Sorry boys, but there isn't any. Rex had barely taken 2 steps into the corridor when he heard several alarmed shouts fill the air, followed by a loud thud. Pulling his helmet back over his face, he turned on the spot, nearly running into Fives. It was through pure habit that he found his twin DC-17s in hand, trained on the 2 figures who had materialized some 50 meters away, smack dab in the middle of a group of surprised clone technicians. The clone pilots who had been seated by the door had all jumped to their feet, many of them slowly lowering their weapons to the ground. General Kenobi looked up at him, eyes wide and desperate. He was kneeling on the ground, holding an unconscious Commander Tenno in his arms. Both Jedi were covered in a strange layer of dust, similar to Genosian sand, but the color wasn't exactly the same. It had a harsh, darker texture, forming a thin film of dust about their feet. General Kenobi! Rex exclaimed, forcing his feet to move forward, ignoring the surprised shouts of his men. His fingers grappled for his comlink as he typed a quick confirmation to the Admiral. Fives was right behind him, boots pounding loudly against the docking bay's metallic floor. The general shook his head as Rex approached. One of his hands was pressed against Tenno's temple. Now that he was closer to them, Rex could see a few bruises on the general's face, while the commander appeared to be mostly unharmed. But she's stable, but I can't get her to wake up, General Kenobi said, voice tight. I'm not sure what happened. Rex watched as he carefully lowered the commander to the ground. He looked at Fives, then back at Rex, eyes shining with open confusion. Before Rex could reply, Cody raced into the corridor, looking more relieved than Rex had ever seen him. I'll call the medics for Commander Tenno, sir, Rex said slowly. Are you all right? General Kenobi didn't exactly look all right, though Rex couldn't say why. The bruises would fade soon enough, but something told him that there was more, that the general was reeling from something he didn't completely understand. Yes, I'm fine, Captain, Kenobi answered. He looked around the bay, at the crowd of pilots and technicians surrounding them. Then he closed his eyes for a moment. Where is Anakin? He asked, opening his eyes. He turned towards Rex with expectation. Rex tilted his head, glancing at Cody, who now looked a bit more concerned than before. "Sir," Rex said, "we thought General Skywalker was with you." Only then did he realize that his own general was nowhere to be seen. Kenobi frowned. He stood slowly, stumbling for a split second before he regained his footing. Kenobi spun around, presumably scanning every single person in the bay. There was a strange sort of emotion flickering in his eyes. It wasn't exactly panic, but more a deep-seated worry. To Rex, it was completely unfamiliar. Kenobi was always calm and steady, even during the more difficult missions, but now it seemed like something vital had changed. The general said slowly. "I thought, he's not here." He blinked owlishly before looking around again. "We haven't seen him, sir," Rex replied, the last of his short-lived enthusiasm dying into cold nothingness. The general seemed dazed, fixing his glassy stare on the floor several meters from where the commander lay. While he was here physically, it was clear that his mind was far, far away. "There's definitely something going on," Rex thought. "I just wish I knew what it was." Even more than that, he just wanted to know what happened. Cody shifted to glance at his comm link. "General, the medics are here. We can continue searching for General Skywalker after we take Commander Tenno to the medbay," he said. To Rex, the next few minutes seemed to go by in a blur. The medics had come through, carefully lifting the commander onto a stretcher before hurrying off to the medbay. General Kenobi followed them silently, his face blank. Rex and Cody followed him, exchanging quick worried looks. What exactly had happened out there? She was drifting. Ahsoka felt warm, safer than she had been for a very long time. Slowly, she opened her eyes, barely registering Anakin sitting at her bedside, looking pensively out a nearby window. He looked very calm and relaxed, and the light he projected into the Force was soothing to her frayed nerves. Ahsoka gasped and sat up, horrifying memories of the Genosian parasites rushing back to her. Varys had been infected, begging to be killed. The last thing Ahsoka remembered was being alone, fighting against something she didn't understand. What ultimately happened to Varys and the clones? Anakin rushed over and knelt down next to her bedside, placing both hands on her shoulders. His blue eyes stared into hers, warm and welcoming as they always had been. "It's all right, Ahsoka, it's okay," he soothed with a gentle smile. "You're safe." The Force stirred. "Safe," she echoed, a sinking feeling entering the pit of her stomach. Anakin didn't reply, but rather continued smiling at her. The sight of it sent a shiver down her spine. The Force moved again, twisting uncomfortably in a way which seemed oddly familiar. What's happening?" she asked. Anakin's smile grew wider before he stood up, eyes reflecting the medbay's bright lights. "You've only ever slowed me down, Ahsoka. But now..." He turned towards her, and Ahsoka's heart plummeted. Anakin's eyes were yellow, positively gleaming with a twisted mirth. "Master," she whispered. "Now I'm free," he hissed. "The Jedi are all gone, and you're all that's left, my little Padawan." Ahsoka shook her head, the blankets bunching in her fingers as she backtracked, pressing herself against the cushions of the bed. "The Jedi were gone." "No," she whispered, but the Force was bleeding, screaming into unfathomable darkness. "I killed them." And her master smiled again, yellow eyes shining. He held up an unfamiliar lightsaber hilt and ignited it, revealing a bleeding red blade that shrieked into the Force. Echoing screams filled her ears and her blood ran cold. The voices, they were crying for help, blood-curdling shrieks of children. "No. And now it's your turn," Anakin whispered, his towering form advancing towards her. Ahsoka's eyes were wide, her horrified face reflected in her master's corrupted gaze. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Then the lightsaber was falling, a streak of scarlet rushing downwards until its hot blade finally met her skin. "No." Ahsoka opened her eyes, sitting bolt upright with a gasp. Her heart pounded in her chest and she struggled for air, her mind racing to get her emotions under control. "Calm. Need air." The effort seemed to only make it more difficult for her to breathe. She distantly heard a voice shout before warm hands pressed onto her shoulders. Still shaking, her mind automatically leaped to her master and she almost cried out before she realized that the face above her was of a clone. "Commander, take some deep breaths for me, okay?" Kix's voice was calm, but there was a sort of uncertainty in his eyes. Ahsoka forced herself to ignore that, choosing to instead focus on her breathing. She looked around for a moment, realizing that she was in the Resolute's medbay, of all places. Around her was the familiar white-paneled walls and many portable trays laden with tools. It was so bright that it almost hurt. Tears sparked in her eyes as she shaded her face with the hand that was not connected to the monitor above her. "There's light here. I'm on the Resolute." "Wait. Wasn't she?" "What happened?" she gasped out. We were, she trailed off, unsure of what to say. Kix tilted his head. "It seems as though you just had some exhaustion, sir. I'd suggest taking it easy for the next few hours," he explained. "But..." The medbay doors slid open. Obi-Wan walked in slowly, his eyes shining. He looked exhausted, his shoulders hunched and his expression grim. As Ahsoka met his gaze, he hesitated, coming to a standstill. Ahsoka's heart began to race again. Everything around her seemed to mute. It was only her and her Grandmaster in the room now, nothing else mattered. She shivered, swallowing the emotion which somehow had gathered in her throat. Closing her eyes, she formed the words in her head before speaking, dreading the response yet to come. Where's Anakin?" Summary. "And things will only get messy from here." The general remained oddly quiet as they walked behind the stretcher. His eyes seemed to have a faraway look, as though he wasn't focusing on much besides putting one foot in front of the other. Rex felt his stomach twist at the sight and fought the urge to stare. It was so uncharacteristic for the man that it seemed surreal. The medics guided the stretcher next to one of the beds before transferring Commander Tenno over. Though she was still unconscious, Rex was sure she would be all right. There weren't any noticeable bumps or bruises, piquing his curiosity even further. All of this just didn't make sense. Even as the medics began to check the commander's vitals, General Kenobi remained standing by the door, face blank. "Looks like she's stable, sir," Kix announced. Rex sighed in relief before glancing back towards the doorway. He barely caught sight of the generals retreating back before the doors hissed shut. "Excuse me, Kix," Rex murmured. The clone medic glanced up at him and nodded, and Rex walked out of the door to follow Kenobi. "What is going on?" Rex spotted him walking down a corridor towards the nearest viewport. Even as he watched, Kenobi folded his arms, looking as though he was deep in thought. Cautiously, Rex moved to stand behind him. "General Kenobi?" Rex asked after a few long moments, once he realized that the Jedi was not going to start any conversation. He suddenly felt extremely uncomfortable, as though he was intruding on Kenobi's privacy in the worst way possible. Part of him wanted to turn around, to go back to the medbay and look after his commander. "It's probably what I should be doing," he told himself. The general turned around slowly. In that moment, it seemed as though the man had aged decades, the lines in his face cast deep into shadow by the external lighting of the Resolute's hull. His eyes were guarded, lined with exhaustion. "Yes, Captain," he replied. "Based on the scans, the medics say that Commander Tenno will make a full recovery." "She only had some mild bruising," Rex said. Kenobi nodded. "Thank you," he said. "That is good news." Rex waited for Kenobi to say something else, but the Jedi remained silent. He opened his mouth and closed it, struggling to come up with something else to say. The silence was quickly becoming awkward. Kenobi arched an eyebrow. This was all too strange. Rex found himself unable to contain his curiosity. "If you don't mind me asking, sir, what happened?" he blurted. When Kenobi didn't immediately answer, Rex's heart sank to his stomach. He was sure this was a major breach of protocol, but he found himself continuing anyways. The situation called for it. "Your ship disappeared off our scanners for a good while there," he said. Expression darkening immediately, Kenobi frowned. "Now that is a question," he said slowly. He paused and then sighed, closing his eyes. "There really isn't a good way to explain it." "Right." That made very little sense. Kenobi was very good with his words, Rex knew this firsthand. If he was unable to explain something, then whatever happened must have been extremely unusual. And for something to rattle Kenobi this much, whatever happened while the Jedi were away must have been terrible. "Understood, sir," Rex said finally, unable to come up with anything else to say. The general's closed eyes squeezed slightly before he rubbed the bridge of his nose. Rex could see the shadows under his eyes, the gauntness of his face, emphasized by the fading bruises. A moment passed before Kenobi pulled his hand away and opened his eyes. Sir, are you sure you're alright? Rex asked again. Kenobi was very good at directing the attention away from himself, especially when sick or injured. This could easily be another one of those situations, but there was no way of knowing that for sure right at this moment. Yes, I'm fine, Captain, Kenobi answered quickly, giving him a grim smile. There's no need to worry. There's every need to worry, Rex thought sourly, but he knew that pursuing the topic any further would get him nowhere. Kenobi could be so incredibly stubborn sometimes. Very well, sir, he said. His comlink beeped, and he glanced down at it to see a message from Kix. It looks like the commander has woken up, he said. Kenobi muttered something under his breath that Rex couldn't catch. Should we head back to the medbay, sir? Rex asked, pretending not to notice. Kenobi nodded and gestured for Rex to lead the way. After you. Rex took a breath, pushing his uncertainty down and away, before turning around and walking back to the medbay, the general's quiet footsteps echoing behind him. Obi-Wan didn't really want to be anywhere near the medbay if he was being honest with himself. Unfortunately, being honest with himself would only get him so far, especially in these situations. He had to tell Ahsoka, Anakin's Padawan, what happened. He had to tell the Admiral and his men what happened. Worst of all, he would have to tell the Council what happened on Mortis. Of course, there was also the question of what exactly he should tell the Council about Mortis. But now wasn't the time for him to be thinking about any of that. Now, he had to walk into the medbay and tell his Grand Padawan the exact opposite of what he wanted to say and what she wanted to hear. Now, he would have to bring even more grief and despair into her life. As he walked closer to the medbay, Obi-Wan could hear voices filtering out through its sealed doors, loud and frantic. Down, sir, please. Obi-Wan closed his eyes and took a breath, desperately pushing away the headache brewing behind his eyes. He could feel Rex's Force presence standing behind him, quiet, but observant. His worry filled the Force, despite Obi-Wan's efforts to reassure him. He was fine. More muffled voices, then he heard Ahsoka speak, gasping. Her panic was pounding against his shields, traveling along their light bond like small shocks of electricity. What happened? He heard her ask, voice muffled. We were. She's scared, frantic, confused. At her age, I can't say that I blame her. Obi-Wan opened his eyes. He needed to go in and speak to her. There was no avoiding it, as much as he wished to go somewhere else, anywhere else. With another deep breath, he reached for the button next to the door and pressed it. The door hissed open, and he walked slowly inside. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Rex hauled outside the medbay, near the corridor entrance. Here goes nothing. Ahsoka's head jerked up and she closed her mouth, looking as though he'd interrupted her mid-sentence. She was sitting up, attached to a monitor that displayed her vitals, and staring at him as though her life depended on whatever he said. Well, if he thought about it, that was true, as much as he wished otherwise. Ahsoka shivered and closed her eyes, and Obi-Wan wanted nothing more than to run out of the medbay, away from all of this. Every muscle in his body was exhausted, dragged down by his duty. But he had little choice in the matter. Where's Anakin? Ahsoka's voice trembled as she spoke, easily revealing the panic that still consumed her. What was he supposed to say? He really didn't want to do this. Obi-Wan exhaled. Ahsoka, he began, keeping his voice soft and quiet. I need you to calm down. His voice seemed to echo loudly through the medbay. Kix remained standing at Ahsoka's bedside, not quite moving away, but trying to make it look like he wasn't listening to the conversation. In fact, all of the medics in the room were trying to look like they weren't listening, even though it was obvious that they were. Ahsoka reeled forwards, prompting Kix to place a gentle hand on her arm. She brushed it off, pushing herself off the headboard of the bed with shaking arms. Obi-Wan took a few steps forward. Why? She asked. Where is he? Obi-Wan swallowed. What should he even tell her? That Anakin Skywalker, his former Padawan and her master, was missing and possibly even dead? That he was alive and overtaken by the dark side? There were no clear answers, none. He knew all too well the pain of losing a master and the devastation that followed. Ahsoka didn't deserve to face that kind of pain, not now and not like this. Ahsoka, he managed, voice drying up in his throat. He swallowed again, feeling his heart beginning to race in his chest. Calm. He needed to stay calm, for Ahsoka, and for his men. And for my own sanity. The door hissed open again, revealing Rex. The captain immediately walked to Ahsoka's other side, leaving Obi-Wan standing alone at the foot of the bed. "Master Kenobi, he's my master," Ahsoka exclaimed frustratedly, reaching forward as though she wanted to rise from the bed. "Commander, you really shouldn't be walking right now," Kix said softly, placing both hands on Ahsoka's shoulders. She struggled in his grip to get up, ignoring him. Obi-Wan sighed. He took a few more steps and sat down at the corner of Ahsoka's bed. He rubbed at the bridge of his nose, trying to ignore the pounding in his skull. He began, struggling to come up with something to say. Ahsoka paused, eyes narrowing. "Master," she asked, voice tense. Kix continued to hold her down, but she stopped resisting, staring at Obi-Wan with barely concealed worry in her eyes. Obi-Wan moved his hand away from his face and placed it on his lap. "Ahsoka," he said, and swallowed down the emotion rising up his chest into his throat. He forced himself to speak, looking directly at his grandpadawan. "Ahsoka, Anakin is missing. He didn't come back with us." Silence. Ahsoka stared at him for what felt like a long time. The medics in the room fell completely silent, no longer hiding their curiosity. Obi-Wan forced himself to ignore their stares, focusing instead on Ahsoka, who didn't seem to notice them at all. After a long pause, Ahsoka released a heavy sigh and leaned back into her pillows, looking up at Obi-Wan expectantly. Kix released his grip on her shoulders and took a few steps back, averting his gaze. "The men have been searching for him for about an hour now. They haven't found anything," Obi-Wan said thickly. We should prepare for the worst, Ahsoka." Ahsoka closed her eyes, her lips tightening. Though her breathing became ragged, she remained silent. "She's grieving." "Ahsoka," Obi-Wan managed, desperation clawing its way into the pit of his stomach, "please say something. Please." He expected her to lash out, or to be upset at the very least, but this was worse, so much worse. Ahsoka exhaled and opened her eyes. She began, looking directly at Obi-Wan with a strange emotion in her eyes. "I think I need some space, Master Kenobi." Oh. "Sure, Ahsoka," Obi-Wan replied, ignoring the foreign emotions crawling up into his chest again, almost painfully. He forced himself to breathe through that pain. A moment passed, then Obi-Wan slowly stood up and walked away. He walked past Rex, who smiled reassuringly at Ahsoka before patting her head. Obi-Wan turned his head away at the sight, walking quickly towards the medbay's doors and exiting the room. The hallway that stretched in front of him seemed much longer than it had just minutes ago when he was walking to the medbay with Rex. Obi-Wan took a deep breath and rushed towards the viewport where he'd stood before, staring out at the stars. Once he reached the viewport, he closed his eyes and breathed deeply. The emotion, the hurt, he couldn't have that now. He was a Jedi. He needed to be strong, he needed. "Sir." Obi-Wan opened his eyes. Rex stood in front of him, eyes bright and worried. Obi-Wan didn't realize that the captain had followed him out of the medbay, but now that he thought about it, it wasn't really that surprising. Obi-Wan began, trailing off. He took a deep breath, pushing the emotion down and away, almost violently. "I assume Admiral Yularen is on the bridge," he asked finally. Rex nodded. "Yes, sir," he replied. "I'll go speak to him now," Obi-Wan said, nodding. "Thank you, Rex." "Of course, sir," the clone replied. He looked as though he wanted to say something else, but Obi-Wan abruptly turned away and walked back down the corridor before Rex had a chance to respond. Obi-Wan didn't even notice when his feet carried past the medbay doors and to the nearest lift. All he could think about was how to explain what had happened, and what he had to do. Slowly but surely, his feet carried him up through the ship and towards the bridge, away from his failures. Patience had never been Ahsoka's strong suit. Having been released from the medbay that morning, she'd taken up roaming the corridors. A stroll always had helped her in the past, clearing her mind and letting her take a breath while feeling involved. Apparently, the walks didn't always do the trick. After setting foot out of the medbay, she'd counted 3 hours of non-stop walking, and it hadn't done anything to calm her nerves. Anakin was gone, just gone. How the cripping heck was she supposed to react? Every bone in her body desperately wanted him to be alive and well, and she hoped that this was all some sort of practical joke on his part. Then reality would suddenly come back to bite her. And, like all realizations, the memories followed, dragging her mind back down into the darkness of Mortis. Again and again, she watched her master as he advanced towards her, his lightsaber raised as though to strike. Then there had been her dream, something that shouldn't be real, but had felt closer to reality than their confrontation 2 days on Mortis. And now he's gone. She struggled to swallow her emotion again, realizing that she might not have a master anymore. Her heart took control once more as she followed the path of the vicious cycle. Anakin Skywalker is my master and he is coming back, he's alive and well. He is coming back. He has to come back. Please. The hours had blurred together, melding into a haze that did not break until she found the other source of her problems. Obi-Wan Kenobi was a living, breathing reminder of Anakin Skywalker, and it hurt. As soon as he had entered the medbay yesterday, Obi-Wan had seemed oddly withdrawn, his mental shields drawn in so tight that he was almost invisible. He had seemed to be exactly the figure that she'd thought him to be all those years ago as a youngling, cold and evasive towards all conversation. That had been until she'd asked him where Anakin was. Then, the facade had shattered into a million pieces. Never before had Ahsoka wanted her master more than right then and there. Anakin had always believed in Obi-Wan, trusted him, even put his faith in his former master's ability to make things right. Instead, Obi-Wan had essentially told her to believe that her master was dead right to her face. He'd asked her to calm down as though it were a simple flick of a switch from one emotion to none. He'd asked her to do the impossible. But is Anakin dead? Ahsoka felt as though her insides were being boiled, roasted, and wrung out like a washcloth. A Jedi wasn't supposed to feel emotion. No, they were supposed to be like Obi-Wan, cold and withdrawn, watching things unfold before them with their emotions holed up and tossed aside. The only time she'd stopped her pacing had been when her feet had somehow taken her all the way to the very end of the main hangar and its massive array of supply crates. The lighting wasn't as great down there, the nearest ones being the long strips in the ceiling close to 100 feet above. It was a nice, private area in comparison to the rest of the ship other than her own quarters, and Ahsoka was tempted to take a seat on one of the nearby crates before realizing that she wasn't alone. It was there that she'd found Obi-Wan, seated with his back to her, hidden in one of the darkest places of the entire hangar. Her first instinct had been to approach him and ask what was wrong, but something caused her to hesitate. Instead, she quietly hid behind a nearby oil drum and watched, tugging her mental shields back down over her thoughts. For a horrible moment, she thought he'd sensed her. In her mind's eye, she saw her Grand Master turning, his piercing blue eyes boring into her skull. But Obi-Wan hadn't sensed her at all. On the contrary, he was rather open in the Force, his feelings and thoughts laid bare. Ahsoka closed her eyes, exhaling as she forced down her emotions with an iron fist. She did not want to talk with anyone, least of all Obi-Wan at the moment, but his presence was oddly comforting. For a few minutes, Ahsoka found herself floating, riding the fine line between meditation and reality. For the first time that day, she was able to relax. Obi-Wan's presence seemed to fade from her mind as she worked to calm her nerves. Her calm, however, shattered rather abruptly as the Force shifted nearby. Ahsoka withdrew from the Force and held her breath. Had she been hallucinating? Cautiously, Ahsoka glanced over the oil drum once more to stare at the still form of her Grand Master. He was always so stoic and strong, collected and calm as a Jedi counselor should be. It didn't seem that way now. His face was blank, as it always was. In the Force, however, there was guilt, there was distress, and there was a sorrow that ran deeper than Ahsoka had ever realized. Obi-Wan's emotions mirrored her own, and she hadn't realized it until now. Guilt twisted in her stomach as she realized that he was feeling almost the same way that she did. Part of her wanted to run to him, to start speaking to her Grand Master again and to just fix this strange impasse that had come between them. The other part of her recoiled at the idea, remembering that he told her that Anakin was most likely dead, that Obi-Wan was cold and distant, emotionless. Well, he certainly didn't seem emotionless at the moment. Obi-Wan's feelings flowed out into the Force like a sonic charge, painful and terrible. It made her feel even more conflicted than before. What was she supposed to do? Ahsoka breathed out silently. She couldn't deal with this, not now. Carefully, she pulled away from the oil drum and slipped towards the hangar's exit, leaving Obi-Wan to sit alone in the darkness. Behind her, the Force cried silently, forming a sad halo about his presence. She fought to ignore the quiet misery all the way back to her quarters, turning her head to the way that it slid into the Force and permeated the very air. Her mind, in fact, was so preoccupied, that it didn't even register when the terrible sorrow dissipated over the distance. The Force, once again, was quiet, as though the misery was never there in the first place. Once Ahsoka arrived at her quarters, she seated herself on her bunk, eyes fixed at the wall across from her. She didn't know what to think anymore. Anakin couldn't be dead, it was impossible. He was her master. He wouldn't leave her behind like this. Obi-Wan didn't know what he was talking about. He was wrong, he had to be wrong. Anakin was probably hiding somewhere, waiting until the right moment to come in and surprise them. She was sure of it. It was only a matter of time. Sighing, Ahsoka leaning back against the bunk. She wasn't tired, but she really didn't want to do anything right at the moment. More than anything, she just wanted Anakin to be here now. He was the one who brought their lineage together. Without him, it felt as though she and Obi-Wan were cast off in opposite directions, like strangers. "Help me, Master, please come back, please, I need you." With that thought, a knock sounded at her door. "Ahsoka, may I come in?" Obi-Wan's muffled voice filtered through the overhead speaker. Ahsoka wondered if she could just pretend that she wasn't in the room. Maybe he would give up and look for her somewhere else? It was unlikely, considering that Obi-Wan probably came here once he picked up her Force presence. It only made sense. "Come in," she called, her voice slightly hoarse. She sat up properly on the bunk and clasped her hands in her lap. The door hissed open and Obi-Wan walked in. Compared to earlier, he looked slightly more alive. His posture had improved, for one thing, and he no longer looked as though he was about to keel over onto the floor. What she noticed more than anything else, however, was his presence. In the Force, she could barely feel him, despite their proximity. Obi-Wan was shielding himself from her, and very well at that. She smothered a small spike of irritation as she realized that her Grand Master could shield so much better than she could. "One day I'll get there," she told herself. "Ahsoka," he greeted with a nod. "I'm glad to see that you're better." Better. Physically, perhaps, but inside she was reeling. She didn't know how to feel, how to react to all of this. She was confused, feeling as though she was cast off, abandoned. "Thanks," she replied, unsure of what else to say. "I just spoke with the council," Obi-Wan continued. He sighed and ran a hand over his face. She then saw the faded bruises littering his face, much like her own. "Why didn't I see them earlier?" "Ahsoka, they want us to return to Coruscant."